everyone, we welcome you to the Debate Circle, and I'm your moderator of today. My name is Jena Ching. On today's conversation, we will be talking about the BBI and the youth, which has been a very rampant conversation in the times that we're in. To lay context to this conversation, the BBI was stimulated by the handshake that we have after the elections that we had around the 2017. So ideally, the President, Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta, and his handshake colleague, Mr. Raila Odinga, sat in May 2018 and decided to roll out this BBI report to set the motion for things they felt like should be addressed in the coming term. So to lay more perspective, I'll hand it over to Taitro that will introduce the purpose of the task force. So Taitro.
The purpose of the proposed BBI task force was to look into 9 areas which President Uhuru Kenyatta and Mr. Raila Odinga felt were key in ensuring that they build a better Kenya for all the citizens living in it currently. So we had 9 thematic areas. We had national ethos, responsibilities and rights of citizens. We had ethnic aggravation and cohesion. We had inclusivity, divisive elections, shared prosperity, corruption, devolution, and safety and security. On today's discussion, we'll of course be looking at specific proposals in the BBI that are geared towards the youth of this country and how you can read through the fine print and see what they're really trying to affect the youth with.
So we have 9 thematic areas, but in today's discussion specifically, we will dwell on the BBI and the youth. To further bring the concept of the youth into picture, we want to shape the idea of how the BBI has brought out the concept of the youth in this country. Moving forward, I think I will hand it over to Stephanie that will give us the concept of the youth demographics in Kenya.
Thank you, Jane. So basically, when we talk about the youth, I think it's essential for us to understand where we are coming from as a country so that we understand why it's essential for us to have the conversation around the youth here. So first of all, when you look at our history, back in the 1960s when we were gaining independence, we had 10 million people. And that seems like a very insignificant amount, seeing that we're now 50. But yeah, so around that time, leading up to 1978, we had a lot of rapid growth. We had so many people, well, getting a lot of more people. And then we started experiencing what is called a youth bulge. So that's where at least 20% of your population is youthful. And then that created a very big problem, yeah? Because we have come from a time where we do not have such distinct marks of who is what age, yeah? Remember that back in the day, the likes of Dedan Kimathi, who was under 30 when they started fighting for the independence of this country, and so many other things were done by people who are of around our age, yeah? Most of the cabinet ministers were really young, under 30s, and so many other things, yeah? Then now we have to think about the fact that there's a demographic to think about, that there's age distinctions. There's 0 to 18, there's 18 to 35, that is now the youthful population, and there's above 35. So I think that is what has created the need for us to have this conversation, because if you look at the fortunes of the youth back in the day, before we actually started thinking around the youth demographic, before they became a 60% of the population, you'll see that they were doing really well and that there were so many policies that may not essentially have affected the youth, they affected the general population. But then, of course, now with the youth bulge, we now see a demographic of people whose needs need to be taken into account separately from everyone else. Yes, we are all Kenyans, but then there's the needs of specific groups that need to be catered for individually. Otherwise, if we were to go with the one-fits-all method, there's people who are going to be disadvantaged because of so many other things. There's experience that we're going to talk about. There's so many other things that needed to be taken into consideration. So I think the reason we're having this conversation today is because that foundation was not laid well at the time when it should have been laid, at the time when there was a burgeoning youth group. So now we are looking at a time when the youth are just there. There's a number of them. Their issues have not been taken care of. And now we're trying to figure out how can we take care of this very dominant age group. Because we're looking, if we project into 2024, we're looking at an age group that is 70% of our population. That needs quite some bit of affirmative action for that particular group, which is why we are having the discussion we're having today. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie, for your sentiments. Just to give further comments, the youth contain at least 75% of the current Kenyan's population. And as Stephanie is elaborating, there has been a dynamic shift from the youth that we have in the early 90s and the type of youth that we have currently now. Therefore, as we're making policies and we're talking leadership and we're talking youth involvement, we have to factor in how dynamic this age group and the demographic is. So to lay a bit of context on the BBI agenda, I'll just lay out the key areas that are of keen interest to us today. So one of the key areas is the establishment of mechanism to ensure more accessibility into the job market, especially at the entry level. One of the biggest challenges we usually have is the youth are not considered at the very go. We look at the package of the youth as a portfolio, as PR. So one of the things that the BBI ideally wants to address is how do we ensure that the youth are considered for job opportunities at the very beginning. Another thing is the elimination of barriers to accessing the 30% procurement provision and youth funds. Of course, there's always the question of capital, the question of investment, so it tends to want to discuss the process of procurement and ensuring that youth are properly incubated. Agenda 3 is how to exhaust the execution of the youth development policy, which was of 2019. So one of the key areas that the youth development policy of 2019 last year that the cabinet enacted was to discuss some of the mainstream issues, or to align the youth agenda to the Big Four agenda of the president. Of course, tapping the youth agenda to the Vision 2030 of the country. That was the question of the medium term, the concept of sustainable development goals, and of course, tackling some of the youth issues in the constitution of the 2010. Agenda 4 was decreasing the expenses increased in starting and sustaining business enterprises. There's a lot of economic themes in the BBI report in regard to the youth. There was also the question of the 7-year tax holiday, which addresses the question of income tax and subsidies. Another agenda that it seeks to talk about is ensuring 30% opportunities are reserved for the youth and other marginalized persons. 30% seems like an insignificant proportion, but if you compare to what we're having currently, it seems like a good starting place. Another agenda was the policy framework for creating potential of the youth in sports, music, dance, art, and ICT. Again, we see a bit of the BBI trying to tap into the dynamic nature of youth, moving aside from how we usually talk of youth and employment. Another agenda was the incubation hub and the industrial parks. Similar things we've had before are the Wezo Fund and the Youth Development Fund. So extensively, you see a document that tries to really tap into the question of the youth in this country. So moving forward, I want us to start discussing a very key and a bit of, we've done a bit of something in the same area, the tax holiday. So the tax holiday is a 7-year income tax for enterprises. And just to lay context, I'll hand it over to my panel. I think we'll start with Moha.
So thank you very much, Jean. So the thing with the tax holiday is that on the onset or at the initial idea, it sounds like a very good one, that we're going to give tax holiday to youth-led funds, to youth-led enterprises. At a time when we've been giving tax holidays really to corporations and multinationals who are coming to invest a certain significant amount in the country, and they're going to create jobs and whatnot. But before we get to the point of taxation, and something like company tax is just charged after profits, whatever profits that we make. But have we really thought about, before we get to profit, there's a lot of production that goes into making a profit. There are equally other taxation policies within the production of the business, within the existence of the business, before we close our year and declare profit. What sort of ideas, what sort of suggestions is the BBI giving to that? And we really find that there isn't a significant amount of incentive that is being given to the youth to develop along the business before they can declare profit. That there are bottlenecks along the way, and without solving those bottlenecks, really the idea of a tax holiday on income of particular companies led by youth is a far-fetched idea.
Okay, Mohammed says that the income tax for the young people is a far-fetched idea. Let us hear what Stephanie has to give in regard to the same.
Now, that is a very, very long conversation that we cannot exhaustively cover, but I'll begin by trying to understand exactly where the people who came up with the concept of the BBI and the 7-year tax holiday were trying to come from. Now, tax holidays have been used across the world to sort of try and create a really nice business environment. And I understand because, again, we're trying to have the conversation around employment because, you see, we have now moved from this is not the 1980s where the government was creating jobs for people. This is not a time when everybody could be absorbed in the sector. In 1978, we were 15 million. Of course, there was ways you could create immaterial posts so that someone can have a job. We are now in 2020 and we are moving forward and we are going to be at a projected, 50, 60 million people. The government has now ceased to have the role of job creation and started becoming an enabler of jobs. Yeah. So I would try and understand where this particular, I wouldn't say it was ill-intentioned, maybe not clearly thought out, but I feel as if it's coming from a place of trying to create a conducive environment, which is the role that the government plays genuinely. Yeah? But then again, there's a problem of tax incentives because over generous tax incentives then beat the purpose. Yeah, like we've talked about, I think now we also have to take into consideration the space and the time we're in with a pandemic in play and of course the economics around the pandemic and so many other factors that have affected our country and so many other countries. We're not seeing the global economy bouncing back the way it's supposed to. We're not seeing our Kenyan economy bouncing back. So again, I'll keep asking the question, what is the role or how does this all play into the current situation, yeah? And of course, we did not anticipate such a situation. But then again, at implementation stage, will we now go ahead with it blanketly because we didn't anticipate there's going to be a pandemic and whatnot and whatnot? And then again, I understand where it was coming from because what tax incentives do is reduce, especially for people who are trying to invest, the cost of capital for high-risk new investments. That's perfectly fine. But then again, I think what I fault this document for, in as much as it is very well-intentioned, because again, there's of course the saying that clean knives still make very painful wounds. It doesn't matter how well-intentioned your document was. If it doesn't serve the purpose, it just simply doesn't serve the purpose. So I think what I'd fault it for is to assume that there is a one-fits-all approach, that tax incentives is only a tax holiday and it's supposed to work. There's so many other things that factor in, like he said. We're looking at cash flows, yeah? And I'm going to look at it in two ways, because one of the reasons we can give tax incentives is probably to attract foreign investments, but also to benefit local citizens. So even if you were to look at foreign investors would still invest whether or not to give a tax holiday, because before someone decides that I'm going to invest, they will look at their internal rate of return. If it is a positive, in short, we're looking at what cash flows are they looking to make. If it passes a certain threshold, they would have invested regardless. So it would be very simplistic for someone to argue that it would increase foreign direct investments. We have seen them before. KRA has decried the fact that they have lost at least 478 billion in taxes or in revenues of tax holidays that have spurred such little investment. Now, locally, there's a whole conversation around it. The concept of, do we have enough demographic to justify a 7-year tax holiday? Like I've said, there's those companies that were doing the bare minimum, the ones that would have survived anyway because the ones that would have died off anyway, and then there's those ones that would have survived because their cash flows were really good. What I think we should have been looking at is how do we create an environment that buffers businesses in terms of their cash flows? Like he said, before you get to the point of paying tax, you have to have something you're paying tax out of.
Just to ask a quick question, you mentioned how it's an overgenerous or more of the government trying to overachieve. But don't you think it's also an initiative to encourage the youth to start? Because there's the question of breaking the barriers of having youth incorporate their businesses as at entry level. There's always the question of we may raise a certain amount of profit, but if it doesn't meet threshold and considering tax, then I'd rather not do it. Don't you think that the report tries to some capacity tackle the question of, can we encourage at least?
If that is what the aim was, then I feel as if it's a very simplistic method to get there. Like I have said, first of all, it is something that cannot be taken as this is an incentive that has been proven to work in correlation with other incentives. Look at Singapore, look at China. Some of these countries that have achieved what we'd say is a really nice entrepreneurship space. It wasn't just about incentives or tax incentives, or first of all, very broad-based tax incentives. Remember the document says, give a 7-year tax, at least 7 years. 7 years is quite a long time. It's a really, really long time. So it's a 7-year tax holiday for youth-owned businesses. Again, the youth-owned businesses, the concept of beneficial owners. This is one really long conversation because there's so many.
I think we're going to pass it to Taicho. Taicho, Stephanie argues that the 7-year tax holiday is such a simplistic view, and 7 years is quite the duration. So what do you have to say in regard to that?
Let me give a bit of background. When the CS Ukuyatani was reading the budget, he said that the economy had been triple shocked. There was COVID, there was locusts, and there was drought going on. At the reading of that budget, it was already calculated and projected that there would be a deficit of around 1 trillion that they would need till the next financial year. So when I read this and understood that there's a 7-year tax holiday, it brings a lot of questions into mind. Firstly, why would a government that already has a deficit in financing itself give away part of a major revenue stream? And that implies, therefore, that they do understand that for youth to set up businesses in Kenya is such a difficult hurdle, and those that do don't really get to the heights of fiscal prosperity as they should, and therefore giving a 7-year tax holiday because they don't get any from the youth whose businesses they were taxing in the first place. So that's the first implication. Another implication Steph mentioned was the foreign direct investment and the concept of beneficial owners. So maybe there's a niche amongst that youth business community somewhere that has some beneficial business owners getting a figurehead for their business who's in the youth space and bringing a product that has already been tried and tested and that is earning insane revenues. And so they just eat for a nice 7 years as, you know, everything else goes on. So there's those two perspectives. It's either they know that the business environment in Kenya is very hard for any youth trying to get into it, such that they won't suffer any loss in revenue if they give that tax holiday, or there's a specific niche they're trying to cater for that can appoint youth as figureheads for their businesses and continue reaping a lot of profits. And also it seems very simplistic, as Steph said, because the biggest issue for any young person trying to start a business in Kenya is not taxes. There's bureaucratic due diligence procedures. There's lack of management skills. There's difficulty in getting initial capital. There's lack of market awareness. Maybe there's even lack of market because they're trying to all do the same thing. So there's a lot of things that need to be addressed before we get to the point where Moha was saying that now you have cash flows that can actually be taxed. So this seems like a very desperate sort of attempt to attract youth towards the proposal, without really addressing the reason why you would need a tax break in the first place and why they can do without revenue from youth businesses.
Just to throw it to our audience, you can send in your questions and your comments. We will be taking your questions as well. Taicho mentions very interesting aspects of the bureaucratic process, the market, the lack of an existing market, and how the 7-year tax holiday is specifically geared to a unique niche. Basically, it doesn't factor everyday youth. Therefore, brings in the question of demographics. Does the BBI actually capture the dynamic nature of the youth in this country? We're going to talk about something that's very interesting next. Whenever you hear the question of student loans, the first thing that hits your mind is HELB. Well, most of us have taken them for various reasons, either supporting your girlfriends, pushing forward your education, supporting your extended families. But the BBI has a very interesting approach to the question of HELB. I think I'll hand it over to Mohammed to tell us more about the BBI and HELB.
Yes. Just before I jump onto HELB, Jean, this is the problem BBI and the people trying to lead the youth agenda in this country. Whereas on the face of it, they present it as a very noble idea, the way Stephanie says. You can feel the sentiments that youth have from Taicho's statements. Taicho tries to suggest not surprisingly at all, that this tax holiday could, in a way, be for the benefit of beneficial owners, that we could bring to market a product, profit over it for the 7 years, and discard it. That is the problem facing the people who are leading this agenda. That on the face of it, they'll present it as a very noble idea. But the problem that they're trying to solve is a youth who absolutely do not believe in a process led by elitists, a process led by people who feel that because the current system isn't working for them, they need to re-engineer it in a way that can start working for them.
Just to pose a question before you continue. So do you feel that the idea of the BBI, because the tone is set by the elite, we have the likes of Raila, different senators, people in high positions, and you don't see everyday youth at the center of coming up with this proposal. Does that make you feel like automatically we cannot accept the BBI agenda?
Absolutely, Jane. And the statement that the Right Honorable Raila put out, was it yesterday or the day before, that there's really little additions or subtractions we could do to the BBI, that we needed to adopt it as it is. That is the epitome of elitist thinking, that we think for you and you need to agree to it. That is the problem that the youth of this country are facing. And for them to expect that the youth are going to jump into the bandwagon and praise the BBI and adopt it is, I think it's going to be an uphill task.
Stress has a burning issue, but I'm going to give you a very brief period to address that before he gets back to the help conversation.
I like what he said, the fact that we have said there's no need for us to add or subtract, and you see some youth leaders saying, you know what, as long as Fulani has read it, it is perfectly fine, you know? And I feel as if, first of all, the fact that some of the things that are in the BBI, like we're discussing a tax holiday, it is overly economical. But what it is being used in a democracy like ours is a political tool. This is a political tool to make people jump into a certain bandwagon. I mean, when someone who is not well read about it, and of course there's very little civic education, for a reason. For someone who's not well read, you go and say, oh yeah, there's a 7-year tax holiday. I don't see why I shouldn't support the BBI. When you look into the fine print, which fine print? There is no fine print because the BBI is the vaguest document I have ever seen. So basically what it does is...
Very strong sentiments there. But to play the devil's advocate, Stephanie, but don't you think even the demographic of the youth that we have are already so politicized? The inclinations to political leaders shapes how we view development, politics, business in general.
The reason why that happens is because of conditioning. This is a classic Pavlov's conditioning, where we have been taught certain things. They have been hammered over and over and over. And what this does is a continuation. This propagates the narrative that the youth are politicized.
I'm gonna have to cut you short there so we can hear what Mohammed has to say about the BBI. Again, if you have your questions, please stream them through. We'll be answering your questions.
Yeah. So, Jen, as regards the HALB recommendation suggested by the BBI report, it suggests that immediately after graduation, that students who had taken the loan will have a 4-year grace period before they can start repaying their installments, and equally that they will not be charged interest up until when they start working. Noble, again, just like the whole document is, yes, but then it's okay, but where are the jobs in 4 years? We've heard of students who cannot secure jobs down the line.
To riddle you, but don't you think as compared to a 1-year grace period, a 4-year grace period is actually pretty generous?
Very true on the face of it. That is the problem with this, that on the face of it, 4 years sounds like a very long time.
Yeah? If we look at the mathematics of the interest rates that could have accrued with an additional 3 years, and you pay that because you've been given a grace period of 4 years, don't you think it's not just nobility?
Can Band-Aids heal burn wounds? Absolutely not. Can Band-Aids... This is the problem. That what the BBI report is trying to do is really, what do they call them? Makeup solutions, sort of. Like, let's hide the ugliness, and then the ugliness will deal with itself. The ugliness that the youth are facing. And the thing is, yes, the HALB recommendation good have done is to look at the intricacies of how do we make sure these youth are able to secure a job within this grace period. More and over and above that, Jane, what percentage of the youth are actually graduating from universities?
Mohammed raised very interesting sentiments here that are we even sure that the youth are able to pay their loans in the first place before we give them a grace period of 4 years? And again, how many people are actually graduating and finishing? And we're not even talking about how many graduates are being absorbed into the economic sector. I'm going to hand over to Taito. What are your sentiments on the BBI proposal towards student loans and help?
I think that the BBI proposal with regards to help is, again, very noble, like Moha said, because what this BBI document is trying to do in relation to the youth is cure the symptoms when there's an underlying disease that is not being addressed. The youth are just asking for an opportunity to work, to put the skills they learned through 844 to good use, earn income, and pay their loans without any issues. But we're looking at a government that at the same time promised 1 million internships per year to the people who are graduating, which did not happen. Just because now there's a handshake with their chief opposition opponent at that time, I'm very skeptical as to how exactly this 4-year grace period is going to provide jobs for people 4 years down the line. Due to COVID, 69% of Kenyans reported reduced income and 40% lost their jobs completely. So already you have people who have been in the workforce, who have been dropped from it, and we keep churning out people every year to get into it, and we're giving them 4 years to find a job, and we're already seeing cases of people tamarking for 4, 5, 6 years. So it doesn't really solve the underlying issue, which is unemployment, and the fact that the job positions are not many enough to absorb the number of graduates we are churning out every year.
Just to cut you short, I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie that had very interesting sentiments. You said because of the dynamic change of the youth demographics, the government has seized its role in absorbing people into the job market. So what do you have to say about that? Since you've already speculated that the government, it's no longer really their duty to absorb people. So what should they do? They've reduced the grace period, they've tried to reduce the interest rates, but it's still not enough. Yet they cannot fully make sure that every other youth out there is employed.
First of all, I think I'll start from what they've all said. The fact that when you talk about the 4-year grace period for help repayment, it is cute, really it is. But what is its practical? What is the underlying issue? I mean, this is not COVID. This is not symptom management. No, there are solutions that, if well put together, could actually help the scourge that we're having. We can't have 9 million unemployed youth. We cannot have a 40% unemployed. And then you want to introduce a 4-year. And then, of course, when you look at it, we have to look at it in 2 ways. Number one, the fact that HELB is an organization that runs on repayments. Already we have deficits in billions of people who have failed to repay their HELB loans. Remember that for some students to go through school 4 years successfully, I have to pay, you have to pay, the people who took loans have to pay. Yeah. So this 3-year gap, is the government going to step in and say, okay, so we understand that this is going to create a deficit of this much in terms of repayment, and this affects ABCD number of students, and we cannot let that happen, because again, education is one of the ways that we do youth empowerment. So is the government stepping in to bridge that gap and say, I will top up whatever I give HELB every year? Or is it, well, don't pay for 4 years, we'll see what happens? I mean, it's very speculative, first of all.
Stephanie has very interesting sentiments in the sense that the 4-year deficit of repayment might actually affect HELB allocation for the ones who will be coming in future. So what does the BBI propose in that 4-year grace period as the economic financial system for the HELB as an organization? Very interesting sentiments there. We look at something else that the BBI proposes, and that's the Youth Commission. The Youth Commission it proposes is going to be made up of 7 members and 4 youth that ideally male and female. I want to understand something. What is the role of this commission? What is the role of the Youth Commission? Is it just another face value representative that, yes, we have a young person here, So what is the role of the commission? What is its purpose? How do we go about executing it? How does the representation look like, trimming down from national level to constituencies and things of that nature? I think we'll start with Mohammed.
So, commissions generally, especially independent commissions after the promulgation of the 2010 Constitution, have been a force for good in the country. You could look at the Judicial Service Commission that has enhanced, let's say, things like the independence of the judiciary. Yes, but there's equally other problems that we face in this country with independent commissions. These are the things of over-involvement or overreaching mandate of the executive. So, whereas I think if it is formed as an independent commission with an independent budget that is trying to advocate for the rights and trying to advocate for a particular setting or for particular needs of the youth, that these independent commissions could actually be an extremely force for good. I still have my fears because the country has shown me that it can really never allay the fears of those who do not think like it thinks. But I think if this commission formed as an independent commission with an independent budget, I think could be a force for good in advocating for the needs of the youth.
So Mohammed, would you sit in that youth commission?
If appointed, why not?
Interesting sentiments. I'm going to pass it over to Steph. Mohammed tells us that if it's formed as an independent commission with an independent budget, then it can be a force to reckon with in this country. Stephanie, what do you have to say about the Youth Commission?
I think it is the fourth independent commission with an independent budget, and that is very fascinating. I mean, we have had an overlap of commissions on commissions. I mean, there's so many questions around. How many do we have currently existing? I mean,
just to ask you a question, but don't you think the commission is formed in regard to the times, that it serves the purpose for that duration?
If it does, then it should be wound up after, I would presume. So what purpose does it serve to have 4 current commissions addressing the same thing? We're having a youth commission, we're having another youth commission with a funny name like a youth council, and then we have another third and fourth, which is what is happening now. There's an overlap of the responsibilities of these youth commissions. And back in the day, we had, I think, the National Youth Council. That was under Kibaki's tenure, President Kibaki's tenure. And I think I'd ask the simple question. We see a lot of that, especially when it comes to the youth. We see a lot of that. We see a lot of over-representation on paper. Yeah. And so I'd ask, there was a National Youth Council. Why did it fail? That is a question that is the thing, those are the things that we fail to do as a country. We fail to take stock. We want to introduce certain things, and I'll look at probably the startups bill. As opposed to coming up with a new startups bill, or as opposed to coming up with a new youth council, why have the existing 79 failed before it? Are we coming up with a mechanism to solve the problems that plagued the others? Or are we just coming with a new name for the same old commissions that failed in their mandate? What are the dynamics that caused them to underperform to the point of being wound up? Is it things that we can control? And if yes, are we seeing that in the new National Youth Commission? Because all we're doing is really just changing them up.
To ask a very interesting question that I feel like is still not being answered, what does the BBI propose as the purpose of the Youth Commission?
Amongst other things, to ensure that we are in touch with morality, I would presume. Taicha?
There was a very contentious clause in the BBI about how they would like to facilitate, let me read it out actually, facilitate generational mentorship and integration of African traditional values with contemporary youth lifestyles while promoting preservation and dissemination of African morals, traditions, and cultures among the young people. Now, it begs the question, what assumption informed that specific agenda of the Youth Commission, because we are greatly underestimating the effect of conditioning. These youth will grow up seeing what the older people do, and they will ape that. So I feel it's a bit odd for them to suggest that one of the mandates will be to, align you in a certain way when all you've done really, subconsciously, is what you've been seeing, let's say your parents or your older people do, even things like corruption. However, my main issue with the Youth Commission is the logic behind the representation. We're looking at more than 20 million youth being represented by 7 people, of which, of the 7, 4 are going to be between the ages of up to 35, and 2 will be male and 2 will be female. Now, 7 people in that commission, representing more than 20 million people, feels like a bit of a stretch and will incur great costs in terms of gaining public representation and public views. So my suggestion for it would be for it to actually be a county-based body that reports now maybe to those 7. But before we talk about the Youth Commission, we have the National Youth Council, we have the State Department of Youth, and we have the National Youth Service. We have these 3 bodies with similar mandates, providing training and education to the youth, linking them to business opportunities, teaching them skills to enable them to make it in the corporate and professional world. All these 3 bodies that are already there without the National Youth Commission already have that mandate. So why is it that the report isn't suggesting a revamp of their role or a revamp of their structure to serve the current climate better, and is instead instituting a whole new commission which will come with extra costs when it has 3 that are supposed to be doing what this proposed commission is doing, and it's not working out?
To pose a question. So you feel like the problem we have is transparency. How I'm understanding it, as Stephanie was trying to echo that, we are not seeing the dissolving of previous commissions and how they're learning from their mistakes before we form new independent commissions. So in your view, you feel like, one, we should increase the numbers, and apart from increasing the numbers so that we have a better representation, is to first rely on what we already have as existing, if I am getting you properly.
Exactly. Accountability is the breakfast of champions, and for us to actually succeed as youth, we need these 3 bodies that are already there to tell us what it is they've been doing for the period of time they've been installed, what are the learnings they found, what are the solutions they suggest, what are the problems they face. Then if we need a new body, it needs to take into account their reports. If we are going to revamp these bodies, we need to address their issues, offer solutions, and build on that, instead of just having a government that is full of bodies that just add bloat and weight and more costs that will come back to hurt us directly. So that's a key issue I'm having with it.
To the panels. There's a general mixed reactions when it comes to the BBI and the youth agenda, in the sense that it sounds very noble, but in your opinions, it doesn't actually tackle the issue of everyday youth. So what would be your recommendations if this BBI actually got passed through a referendum? What would be the recommendations you have towards its implementation? That if this report was actually to come into play, what are some of the things that you would actually want to see shape and form how that implementation process goes along? I think I'll start with Stephanie.
I think before we even get to that point, there's the concept of the youth are not one huge homogeneous block that behaves the same exact way and that needs to be addressed the same exact way. And that is one of the reasons why I feel as if when someone comes to appeal to the youth using a 7-year tax holiday, personally I don't need a 7-year tax holiday, but I am part of the youth. So how am I supposed to benefit from the BBI? Yeah? So we need to look at this in a very holistic way. That the youth, in as much as they have similar issues plaguing them, are they're different individuals that constitute this one group. We have issues that supersede just tax holidays and entrepreneurship and, help. We have issues around leadership and representation. Why is the section under what should be for the youth under shared prosperity? Why don't we have a similar section under leadership? I mean, we have seen such clear elaboration to a T, I repeat, to a T, of what the constitutional amendments for the executive and the legislature are. We have seen them all, but somehow everything around the youth is shrouded in vagueness. We're going to establish a youth commission that is going to ensure that youth issues are looked. What are these youth issues? Why aren't you mentioning them? There's leadership, there's empowerment, there's education, there's employment. We need specificity. The same specificity they used to decide that a DPM could be fired by the president, that there's going to be 2 DPMs, that there's going to be a bloated etc., etc. We need that level of specificity, because only then...
particularly don't agree with the wholesomeness of the youth agenda.
Yes.
You want very specific intentions proposed by the BBI. And I'm asking the question of recommendations. You as Stephanie, what is one of the key issues that you feel like the BBI as a young person would have tackled for you?
Of course, I'd go with one of the things that always faces every young person, unemployment. I refuse to believe that so many problems will stem from there, in all honesty. We're talking about financial inclusion, that stems from unemployment. We're talking about so many other things, exclusion, that stems from unemployment, with lack of access to basic services, unemployment. I feel as if the biggest problem we have as a youth demographic, even if you were to take it as a blanket demographic as they have chosen to, then it would be unemployment. Stop telling me about a 7-year tax holiday when I do not even have the money to incorporate my company so that I can be eligible for the 7-year tax holiday. That is one of the things I feel as if was taken. The youth agenda was really extrapolated into this one big, huge chunk that if we just sprinkled a bit of 7-year tax holiday and help, they should be fine to vote for this. Let's go.
Ideally, the elite are carrying the youth as just part of the agenda. You help propagate what the ideals of the elite are.
Like I've said, this document has very significant changes to the executive and the legislature. Changes that could affect the elite for quite a while to come. To their benefit, by the way. But then again, it's not the elite that will go out to vote. It is this 60% of the population. So why not throw a few nuggets at them, something that will stir them or in them the need to get up from bed and go vote for this particular document. That is what I particularly dislike, the fact that that is the way they have chosen to go. They have chosen to look at the youth not as people or as individuals who constitute a country whose prosperity rests solely on a 70% of the population, but to look at them as votes, as a chance to get what they want in. That is the problem, and that should probably explain the vagueness in the entire youth agenda. Youth issues.
I'm going to pass it over to Mohammed. What are your recommendations towards the youth agenda and the BBI?
Unfortunately, Jane, your question presupposes that I agree to a report, to a report that comes to change my constitution, and then I'll be required to suggest recommendations. So I'm against the whole process from the onset, whereas, yes, I want youth issues to be advocated for in the country, and I would want youth issues to be solved. I'm completely in disagreement with the entire process from the very beginning. But regardless,
If it were
yes, if it were
69% out of the 1% that do not agree, hypothetically speaking,
yes,
actually pass this report, what would be some of the things you'd like to see different? Or ideally, from the conception stage, what are some of the things you would have liked to see being considered in that BBI report?
I would have very much wished for a process that had at the heart of it young people. I think in recent times we've really appreciated that young people from Greta Thunberg to AOC could really spur change. They could really think for a nation. They could really shake the very foundations of a party as great as the Democratic Party. So I think that in them, young people have the ideas of what they want. So if the whole process just had youth-centered leaders or people who really had the youth agenda at heart, as opposed to how the whole process has been handled, I think I would have related with the process better than it is at the moment. What do I think that, what would I have liked them to include in this is, the problem with the whole youth thing is that people throw back the problem at the youth. That, are you facing unemployment? Yes, go out and create jobs, as if it is as easy as that. Go out and be entrepreneurs. Go out and run businesses. But this thing is not for everyone. It is not for everyone to run a business. It is not for everyone to be creating jobs. Some will create jobs, others will get employed. What happens to those who cannot create the jobs? And it is not just as easy as to go and incorporate a company. You will need capital. You will need an office setup. It's crazy. It's really crazy. And so they throw it back to the youth, go out and be job creators instead of job seekers. Why wouldn't they do that?
Mohammed poses a very interesting concept of go ye therefore and subdue the earth. I'm going to hand it over to Taicho. Taicho, what do you have to tell us about if the BBI, first let me not assume that you agree with the report. Can I get your sentiments on whether you agree with this report or you feel like it's just another vague idea?
I don't agree with the report at all. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hypothetically speaking, that if you were part of the few that were consulted at the conception stage, or ideally would be consulted during the amendment. This is hypothetically speaking that there will be an amendment to this this report. What would be some of your recommendations?
Well, like Moha alluded, problems can't be solved at the same level they were created at. And it's very difficult to expect the elite to understand what it is that is going through the minds of someone who's aged 15 to 35. In 2007, we still had one of the key figures in that time, in the handshake of those days, being a key figure in the handshake of now. And it's very baffling that they're still representing us and still presenting the same problems that have plagued us all through. If you look at the Kenyan climate, youth are faced with way more challenges than unemployment. There's gaps in the education system. There's a lack of employment opportunities. There's barriers to entry in business. There's inability to pay back loans. And there's exclusion from decision-making processes. If I were to amend anything, we need greater representation for youth on the ground and having their views imported into this document. Because it's very obvious that there are no efforts at all whenever there's anything like this being done, whenever there's a referendum, whenever there's changes like this being suggested, there's never as vicious a drive towards civic education as there is towards getting the vote. A lot of people right now do not know about the BBI, or rather they know about it, but they don't know what it entails. They haven't read it, is what I mean. And they are waiting for a political leader to come and tell them, pass this document or don't pass this document. If they truly wanted to represent and create a Kenya that is going to be better for us moving forward, they should have insisted on civic education so that each and every person who hears the BBI is not voting for or against it based on what their political leader says, but based on their understanding of it and how they understand it will affect their lives. And civic education is something that is sorely lacking in Kenya. We don't have a culture where we are electing people into positions because of merit or of competence. We're electing people into positions because they come from my place, or my parents are voting this way, let me vote this way. Or they give me
Pitisha TNA or DM six-pack.
Bas, they gave me they gave me a t-shirt and 100 bob, so that's helpful. We need to begin a culture of competence and merit being the key bases on which we employ our leaders, on which we vote in people, on which we vote in things. And the fact that they are not driving civic education means that it'll just be like all the other times they've tried to bring referendums. What's to stop these guys 7 years down the line saying we need to change the BBI? Just so it benefits them again.
Taicho has very interesting sentiments that civic education, competency, being fully represented and not just an idea of representation are some of his recommendations. Eric Mudama has commented that specificity is key in the concept of implementing the BBI. Now, to wind up this conversation, I'm going to give each one of you 1 minute to give us your final takeaway from the concept of BBI and the youth. I think I'll start with Stephanie.
I think as I wind up, I'll say this, that the BBI is a very ideal document, yeah? It presupposes a lot of goodwill. But I'd like for us to understand that if today a paralyzed person wants to run and an able-bodied man does not want to run, both of them will stay at the same place. That there is a fine line between goodwill and action. And unless that fine line is teetered upon, we are literally going nowhere with this bridge. Whether it's supposed to be building or whatever it is, we are literally not moving with it. That's all I'd say.
It's very interesting and captioning. We're literally not moving with it. Mohammed, what is your parting shot?
Painted on the surface as a brave effort to reconcile Kenyans and confront the challenges of our past. This was how the BBI whole process was presented, but unfortunately it has flatly come out as an elitist movement, as a way to recapture power for very few people. They tell us that we're heading to Canaan. I strongly believe we're going back to Egypt. So it's and it does not solve the problems of the youth and of the future. That a problem that is soon happening is climate change. That is currently happening. Taicho tells you that the economy suffered triple shock, from locusts to drought. Problems of the future, problems of today, such as climate change. It is not solving those problems. So I think if youth can be put at the center of it, we can get a process that will try to solve the problems of today and those of the future.
Sector is one of the areas that we can create a lot of employment opportunities.
Exactly.
But we're still upholding previous forms that no longer are accommodating to environmental conservation and claiming that we have no jobs for ye.
Yes, exactly. Jane, if today you went to the market to buy tomatoes to come and sell at your local estate, if they were going for 10 shillings and they're equally going for 10 shillings here, you would not be making a profit. If anything, if you bought them for 15 and sold them for 10, you would be making a loss. This is exactly what the government of Kenya is doing, is that it's getting into businesses that are continually creating losses. The SGR, a train to nowhere, a train to an individual's farm in Kedong. That is the problem that this country is facing, state capture and all of that. So I think that the whole process clearly elaborates that. Thank you.
We're going to hand it over to Taito. Taito, what is your parting shot?
The BBI is going to be an example in the lessons of unintended consequences, if God forbid it is passed, because we are seeing proposals that really make us question how much research went into this and what exactly was the rationale, because a key issue is also trust. If we can't trust the bodies that are mandated to uphold the constitution and preserve, our dignity as citizens of Kenya, it really just makes me feel like anything else they say will be lies. Like I said, there were promises that were made, even the whole laptop saga, that haven't been fulfilled. So what makes us so sure they'll fulfill this? If anything, based on history, the only thing they'll fulfill is increasing the seats to 360 so that we can continue with a very bloated wage bill and these guys can continue satiating their stomachs and, living the life. But examination is very important, examination of the BBI document, so that we don't have parallel policies, laws, and regulations that seem very nice on paper, that are very noble, but they don't translate to the positive evaluation of us as youth in this country. In the streets, they call it the Bure Bilashi initiative because it's well, let me not be controversial, but those are my sentiments. We really need to analyze it and assess it based on competence, merit, and proof from past history.
Thank you very much. Taito here calls it the Bure Bilashi Initiative. Baraka Robata tuned in from Mariakani, Kilifi County. Today's topic is so timely and relevant. Thank you very much. Ian Kemboi mentions that the BBI is a pure scam. Penina Odhiambo echoes to the great discussion that we're having in here. And for more of these discussions, please follow us across our social media platforms at the Great Debaters Circle on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. And until next time, it's been a great panel. Thank you.